I'm Denise Calloway. The racial wealth gap doesn't just impact communities of color. All of us are impacted when parts of our community don't thrive. U.S. Bank is addressing this persistent issue and creating opportunities for improvement with their Access Commitment program. I sat down with U.S. Bank's Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer Greg Cunningham to learn more about how it's expanding resources for diverse businesses, helping individuals in communities of color, and improving career opportunities. We are here with Greg Cunningham, Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for U.S. Bank. Welcome, Greg. We're so glad to have you with us.
Thanks, Denise. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. U.S. Bank has a unique program called Access Commitment, and it is really designed to address the racial wealth gap and to better serve communities of color. Can you help us by explaining what the racial wealth gap is and why it matters to all Americans?
Well, Denise, the racial wealth gap is actually a pretty persistent problem. It actually looks at the wealth of all households across America, and there is a 8-to-1 gap in the wealth accumulation of white households versus black households, and a very similar, although not as great, with Latino households as well. And as U.S. Bank was thinking about how we could make a difference in terms of closing wealth disparities, leaning into social justice issues in the wake of George Floyd's murder right here in Minneapolis, this notion of closing racial wealth disparities was a really important area for us to focus because it allowed us to bring the entire bank to an issue that is persistent in the American economy and affects every single one of us as Americans. You said it perfectly when you said that we should all care because racial wealth disparities actually are a drag on the U.S. economy as a whole. Anywhere from 6 to 8% of GDP growth is impacted by wealth disparities. And every American household suffers from less than $10,000 to $12,000 a year in household income when we have these disparities. So it's one of the issues that we should all care about. And as a financial services institution, it's a place where we can bring our core competencies and really make a difference to ensure racial and social justice in our society.
You talked a little bit about how the Access Commitment program came about. Why did U.S. Bank take this action?
It was important because it is directly tied to our purpose as an organization, Denise. As an organization, our purpose is to power human potential. And I can't think of any better way to ensure that we hold true to that mission than to say we are going to apply our core competencies to something like the racial wealth gap. The Access Commitment will benefit everyone. We're actually starting with the Black community because that's where the gaps are the greatest. But when you think about our purpose to power the human potential, that means for everyone. And so as the Chief Diversity Officer at U.S. Bank, I've never had more job clarity in my entire career, because if we can make that statement to power human potential, benefit every single one of us, equity means we're providing equitable opportunity for everyone. Then that means all of us will have the ability to achieve our full potential. And that's what the Access Commitment aims to do.
What are some of the specific programs that are part of Access Commitment, and how can people access them?
I'll start with the most fundamental program that's part of the Access Commitment, Denise, and that's a commitment to advancing leadership for women and people of color in our organization. And that's critically important because access to opportunity, particularly our employees, allows us to actually deliver on the other programmatic elements of the Access Commitment. So we have sponsorship programs, leadership development programs for women and people of color in our organization. And what we know about why that's important is because organizations that are more diverse at every level of the organization, particularly at the top of the organization, from the board to the senior leadership positions in the organization, There have been studies done for years that have proven factually that those organizations are more profitable. So having a more diverse leadership team and a workforce actually catalyzes economic growth and profitability for organizations. So that's number one. The second part of the access commitment that's really important is a focus on families, individuals and families. Under the individuals and families component of our program, we're focused on closing home disparities. It's a really powerful notion, Denise, because over 75% of white families in this country own their own home. That number is about 44% for Black families. That disparity is something that we should all be concerned about. And when we know the American dream and the most fundamental way that we build wealth in this country is the transfer of home ownership from generation to generation. So if we can close these home ownership disparities, we actually will go a long way in helping to close the home ownership gap. The third piece of the access commitment is a focus on communities. And our focus on community really allows us to think about how we can use our community development resources, community and small businesses, how we can use our resources as the bank to create greater access to capital for organizations in our community like nonprofits through philanthropy, through access to capital for small businesses, through our lending practices, and being much more diligent and intentional about how we can catalyze resources to those small businesses so that they can create jobs. Again, one of the most important ways to build wealth in any community is a community at work. The best social program in the world is a job, Denise. And so if we can continue to support small businesses so they can create jobs, we know we'll build more vibrant and sustainable communities. So those are the three areas of the access commitment with lots of programmatic efforts underneath them, but those are certainly a couple of examples that I'd highlight.
It's interesting though, because you talked about the very first key thing that is part of access commitment is really working on that leadership effort. So as you begin to take a look at creating these leadership opportunities for women and for people of color, and you build this trust, how do you think that will influence those banking relationships that do exist with communities of color and begin to strengthen them? Is that just another way to continue to build that trust?
It is, but I have a fundamental belief that representation matters. And if you don't see it, you don't believe it. And representation matters in every aspect of our society and every aspect of business. And so the more that we can become intentional about advancing leadership opportunities for women and people of color, and there's representation at every level of our organization, it actually helps us be better at delivering what we do well. Denise, one of the things that we learned in our Building Black Wealth study, and we actually did a study over the course of a year in really trying to understand what were some of the barriers to financial services in the Black community in particular, but we also studied women, Hispanics, LGBTQ, and other segments. But one of the things at the Black segment that was really important is that one of the barriers is they didn't see enough Black financial advisors. And you think about how fundamental and how intuitive that is. If you've had this very painful history and you never see people who look like you, and it's less important that they look like you, but it's more important that there are people who are servicing your needs, who share your life experience, who understand your life experience and understand what's culturally appropriate to you, what's culturally relevant, what are some of the things that you are concerned about based on your history and your culture. Those are things that help close that trust gap. And so the same is holding true as we think about home disparities. We have a program within our Access Home initiative that is allowing us to develop more Black loan officers and appraisers so that we can demystify that process of home ownership, that we can demystify that process of what it means to partner with a bank, to get a loan at a bank, by having people who understand your life experience, who understand what's culturally relevant to you, so that process becomes one that is a much more efficient and one that's grounded in trust.
By demystifying that home ownership prospect for folks and encouraging, therefore, perhaps more people to consider home ownership, it's not just about the homes that people buy, it's the communities that really helps to build.
Home ownership, in my opinion, Denise, is less about a house. Home ownership is about human dignity. You know, owning a home is one of the most fundamental ways that we have human dignity in our society. Home ownership allows you to have a sense of pride. It allows you to have a sense of social standing. It allows you to have a sense of, integrity and self-worth for yourself and for your family. You know, the history in the Black community around home ownership is one that is really sort of interesting, and it would probably take us too long to get into that conversation, but I would say it dates back to the time when freedmen and women's, the whole 40 acres and a mule conversation. And what was promised to freedmen and women was land that was captured in Georgia by the Federalists from the Confederates. Well, we know after Reconstruction that all of that went away because of Reconstruction policies and policies of the then Johnson administration. But home ownership was a way for people to feel like that they had something tangible, that now that they would be considered citizens because they owned land. And so when you think about the fact that there's such a gap between white and Black home ownership and what that does to a community, you know, this is one of the most fundamental things that we can work on. And so I agree with you 100%. I think this notion of home ownership is less about a house, but more about this notion of how we have human dignity and self-worth.
Clearly, U.S. Bank has made a tremendous commitment with access commitment to the community and to improving the community. How do you measure it to know that it's working? When will you know that it's being successful?
You know, this is the part that I'm actually really excited about, Denise. I'm glad you asked that question, because this is where I think we are really making a difference. We've actually partnered with a national research institute. It's the Urban Institute out of Washington, D.C. And the Urban Institute is helping us develop a theory of change that's all about how do we build pathways to wealth. But what is embedded in that work, that it's super critical, is we are building a framework, a metrics framework that's actually going to measure the specific outcomes, and we will know whether the investments we are making are actually making a difference or not, because we will have metrics that we measure over the next 2 to 3 years, and we'll be able to measure our progress against those investments and initiatives. And not only will we be able to measure them, but we're actually going to make those metrics public. And so we'll be able to not only hold ourselves accountable, but the general public will be able to hold us accountable to the progress that we're making. And so this whole partnership with the Urban Institute, and we'll release a study, or the Urban Institute will actually release its own independent study about the work they're doing with us that we'll be happy to share with you and your viewers. But this will allow us to really focus on, are we actually driving outcomes? Because I think too many times companies are focused on activities and pronouncements, but at the end of the day, we actually have to change outcomes for people, and that's how we're going to know whether we're successful or not.
Access commitment sounds like an incredibly exciting program that can really make a difference in the lives of people and improve communities that benefits us all. So Greg, we really appreciate you being here with us. Greg Cunningham is the Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for U.S. Bank. Thank you. My candid and exclusive conversation with Milwaukee Mayor Cavalier Johnson on his path to the mayor's office, his neighborhood-centered approach to public safety, and something you can do to make Milwaukee better. That's coming up next on Connect MKE, Conversations on Race.